Okay, hi, my name's Jon Addison and I'm the History Curator at the Queen Victoria Museum and Art Gallery. Now, I'm standing in front of a pretty interesting item here. This is a Northrop loom. It dates to 1958, it was built in England and brought out to Launceston, and it was used in the Waverley woolen mills, which were established in 1874, still going, and they're Australia's oldest blanket maker. So this loom is not the sort of thing you're going to find in your back shed. If you do find one, please let me know. But it is a really interesting item, and it can tell you an awful lot about an industry that has been less studied than it probably should have been. This isn't the sort of thing you'll find, but it is the sort of thing that a very, very large number of particularly women worked on for many, many years. And it's an example of the sort of stories that an object can tell you that is sometimes missing from the main historical record. This particular item tells you about changes in efficiency in weaving technology. These were brought in around 1958. They purchased 16 of these Northrop looms, and it produced plain woolen blankets, which they later dyed. And also blankets featuring four-colour and check patterns. So what's interesting about this is it wasn't just one of these operating. There are a whole lot of these, as I said, 16, but one woman could operate 4 of them at once, moving around them to make sure they kept going. This particular one is awaiting a major restoration project, so that's why it doesn't look in operational condition, but it gives you an idea of the sort of material we're talking about. So one woman could manage 4 looms at a time. After these were replaced in the late 1970s, they were replaced by faster and quieter shuttleless German looms. It meant that one woman could operate 8 looms at a time. So it gives you an idea of how the way that technology has changed the nature of work, and also the nature of work undertaken by women in places, and the impact that major industries such as the weaving industry could have on a town and on the income of families and on the nature of life in the city. Now, you may not find a very large piece of industrial equipment in your shed, but some of the items I have to show you today you might find if one of your relatives was involved in the textile industry in any number of Australian cities that had the textile industry operating as a major part of their economy. Now, I told you a little bit about Waverley. One of the other major mills in Launceston was the Coates Paton's mill. It started off being called Paton's and Baldwin's, and they started in 1922. They ran on hydropower, which is one of the big things that influenced them coming to Launceston. But the sort of thing that you might find and not know much about is something like this. This is a shade card from 1950 by Paton's Knitting, and this is knitting wool rather than material for weaving. And what this book is it's a little book showing the various shades that the company produced. Now, they didn't just do this by taking samples of their wool and placing them in the book like this. There was actually a very specific machine that actually made these. So there are people here, and it's quite an amazing looking thing. We hold the machine itself in our collection, but it doesn't look very exciting on its own. The best way to see it is by looking at this photograph. And this amazing looking contraption is the shade card machine and the woman operating it. So the Coates Paton's mill was the biggest employer in Launceston in the 1960s. They had around 2,000 workers in the 1960s, and a large proportion of these were women. So the big industrial complex still dominates part of the town. It's the other interesting things that you can tell about items that you find relating to the weaving industries is the story of post-World War I migration, the use, in the case of this city, of cheap hydroelectricity, and plentiful supply of water, something you don't necessarily get in a lot of the rest of Australia, and a reliable workforce. So the interesting thing here is that the company was a key part of life People who worked at the company socialised with other people who worked there. They often married people they met at the company. And it was a large, hierarchically structured company. What's really interesting is the fact that with the large number of weaving mills in a city like this, what it tells us is that it changes the dynamic of family life as well, because with a large number of women in employment, this was a really good way that women could actually earn a second income. Now today, second incomes are pretty usual, but during a lot of the period that these mills were operating from, so for example, Coates Payton's operated from 1923 until 1997, this is telling us that a lot of the women who are working here were doing this as part of a second income. So it's leading to a sort of higher degree of affluence in the families that had two incomes at a time when most families operated off only one. These photographs give you a bit of an idea of the scale of the operation. So that one machine I showed you before from Waverley, think of that multiplied by many times. In that case, each four machines operated by one woman. Here's an example from the 70s. This is dyeing. Okay. This large image should give you an introduction to another one of the major mills in Launceston. This is Kelsall and Kemp. But the reason I've shown you this one, even though this session is really about objects rather than photographs, is what's written on the side of the building here, Dr. Flannel. Now I'll show you something in a second that relates to Dr. Flannel, because that was the patent brand name that Kelsall and Kemp used for particular product lines. And it's what they became very well known for. So at this factory, Kelsall and Kemp, producing this flannel, this little box is an interesting item, the sort of thing you may find in a relative's collection. This contains tools that were used by a burler, someone who worked in the burling department. Now, burling is the process of getting the imperfections out of fabric. So basically this is the hand repairing of little slubs and little bits of burrs or anything else that's ended up in the fabric, so that what you're presenting once you've sold it is a perfect product. So in here are all the tools of a burler's trade. So we've got tweezers, large darning needles, these small hooks, and a pair of very well used and quite sharp single-handed scissors, all kept in this little box with a piece of sample fabric. So there were so many different processes and areas to work in this industry. This is why it employed so many people. And when some of the processes involved had to include hand repair of fabric in order to bring it up to the correct standard, this is why it was such a big employer. Now, many people may find an item like this in their cupboards and think not very much of it. This is a flannel blanket produced at the Kelsall and Kemp mills under the name Dr. Flannel. Now, this one doesn't have a label, but I have another item that does. This is a double bed blanket. You can see it's been edged. And this is a very, very common item, but these items can tell you a lot more about production of fabric than you think. One of the other interesting things that we're looking at here, when you buy an item of fabric now, more than likely it's been produced overseas. When we go back in time a short distance, we're finding most of these fabrics being produced using Australian materials in Australian factories and being manufactured by Australians. They were potentially more expensive per piece of fabric than what we're paying now, but all the production was local. And so this is a locally produced blanket using local materials. Other items produced were things like this, and this one's nice. This is a man's woolen flannel jacket. And if you look up here, you can see the label. It says, made from the famous Dr. Flannel, all pure wool. And so when you see anything with doctor, that's actually telling you this is a brand name of Kelso and Kemp. And this was produced using local materials by the women in the Kelso and Kemp factory before they diversified on into synthetic fabrics. Now I've got some really interesting little items here. They're socks, and you can see that they've been printed with a brand name. These were produced by Tamar knitting mills, originally known as the Thine mills. And again, these are another lovely example of local production, but in this case, machine knitting. So this mill was located in York Street in Launceston, which is quite central. And it was unusual in that it was a knitting mill rather than a weaving mill, and it produced items such as this. And the interesting thing about this was a family company rather than a big multinational like Patons and Baldwin's or like Coates Patons. So this is the sort of thing that you may find in a drawer and not realise what they are. So even socks can tell a story, not just about the people who wore them. I mean, these are hiking socks, bushwalking socks, but also they can tell you a story about the people who made them. The women and the men who worked in these factories, tuning the looms, tuning the knitting machines, maintaining the equipment, operating them, producing the textiles. It was a major industry, and it had a major impact as the industry gradually closed down under the impact of tariffs, competition and various other pressures. Right, I have some other items here that all relate to Coates Patons that many of you may be quite familiar with. They're these things. Pattern books. And they're very, very much emblematic of their period. This is actually an earlier one from the time when Coates Patons was known as Patons and Baldwin's. And it's a knitting pattern. These are still produced now and for current styles. But they are wonderful items, and you can find them quite often. And again, this is all to do with local production. They range in time. You can tell the ages from looking at the pictures. They relate to knitting and crochet. They're a fantastic snapshot of the fashions of the time, but also they tell you about the products that were being produced in these, what was happening to the textiles and the yarn that was being produced in this factory in terms of people producing their own clothing at home. Now, many people still do that, but far less do that than was the case in the past. So this is telling you about the place in the home of women who are producing clothing for their families by knitting it or by sewing it. So you get an idea here. We've got a huge collection of pattern books, and these can tell you more than just how to knit a classic 70s jumper. They are really interesting commercial products, really interesting commercial product from Australian textile mills. So objects are as much sources of information about past societies and about people and about your family as any archival source is. You just have to drill down a little bit deeper and work out what those objects can tell you. So some of the objects I've shown you here give you a bit of an insight into life in a small city with some major textile industries. They can tell you about women in the workforce. They can tell you about home life and the way that people produced clothing, the way that people produced textiles and fabrics. And all of these, a museum object does not have to be something that is of incredible value. It can be a blanket or a pair of socks. And these items for us in museums have as much value as some of the other more high profile items. And with your own family history, the same thing can exist. Things don't have to be really old to be significant and to tell you about your family and the life of your ancestors.